Martin Bennett had developed a fascination with radio signals during adolescence. In those days, he lived in a rural corner of the country where he discovered that with even a modest receiver, he could occasionally pick up crackling voices and distant music. While others pursued sports or social gatherings, Martin spent evenings in a cramped attic room, rotating old dials to capture faint transmissions that seemed to arrive from unimaginable distances. This pastime provided a sense of intrigue, a connection to worlds beyond the isolation of his small-town upbringing. Over the years, he transitioned from a hobbyist to a serious radio enthusiast, investing in better equipment and teaching himself about frequencies, propagation, and the subtle art of analyzing faint signals. In his late 20s, Martin relocated to a medium-sized city with stronger career prospects. He rented a one-bedroom apartment in an older building, attracted by its affordable price and convenient top-floor vantage point, ideal for setting up small antennas on the roof. He worked long hours as a technician in a software firm, but at night, he devoted himself to scanning the airwaves, logging interesting call signs, and occasionally chatting with fellow amateurs across the country on ham frequencies. This passion provided a measure of comfort, a means of retaining the sense of wonder he had felt as a child. One autumn, he obtained a vintage shortwave receiver from an estate sale. The metal casing had gone scuffed and dull, but the interior components appeared intact. The moment he powered it up, a swirl of nostalgia overtook him. He heard the familiar crackle, the drifting static, and the intermittent bursts of coded signals. Though he already owned modern radio gear, he relished the old set's glowing tubes and mechanical dials, which gave a tactile beauty to the listening experience. In the ensuing weeks, he used the vintage receiver in tandem with modern equipment, searching for unusual stations or exotic transmissions. Mostly, he encountered standard broadcast material and the random static that radio hobbyists came to accept as routine. Nothing out of the ordinary occurred until one late evening in early November. Martin was hunched over the battered desk in his apartment's corner, adjusting the shortwave receiver's tuning dial while referencing a well-worn frequency guide. Past midnight, he heard a sudden spike of static on a band that was typically quiet at that time. Then, in the midst of the interference, he recognized the faint strains of what sounded like old-fashioned music, a style reminiscent of mid-20th century broadcasts, perhaps slow piano tunes, overlain with the hiss of aged recordings. He leaned in closer, straining to identify the source. The signal was weak and overshadowed by atmospheric noise, but after some patience, it became clear that he was hearing a music program. Between pieces, there was a brief pause, then what sounded like an announcer's voice. The voice was muffled, the words nearly indecipherable. He detected faint references to local weather conditions and a mention of an upcoming event in a place called Redvale. Martin checked his frequency references, suspecting that this was some historical rebroadcast or a pirate transmission. Yet the station identification never emerged clearly. He continued listening for the better part of an hour, enthralled. The station eventually shifted to a half-audible newscast, including references to everyday occurrences, such as a local fair and small-town news about roads or churches. The content seemed hopelessly out of date, some mention of a recent polio drive and a call for volunteers at a library. Then the frequency descended into static. Martin waited for it to return, but received only the usual swish of empty noise. Curiosity gnawed at him, and he wrote down everything he had caught in a small notebook. Over the next few nights, he attempted to find the same transmission again. Initially, he heard nothing but hiss. Then, near midnight a few days later, the station resurfaced. This time, the signal was marginally stronger. Martin verified the presence of orchestral music, a faint male announcer giving local bulletins for an event at Redvale High School, and an unexpectedly abrupt sign-off. Each mention of Redvale perplexed him. Martin was aware of no current town or city in the region called Redvale. Searching online proved inconclusive. He discovered references to small ghost towns named Redwood or Redford, but nothing that matched precisely. The archaic style of the broadcast reinforced his impression that he was tapping into a relic from decades prior. Perhaps it was an archived loop broadcast by a pirate operator, or something akin to a caretaker's tribute to a shuttered station. Intrigued, Martin expanded his nightly sweeps, scanning neighboring frequency ranges. He wondered if the broadcast might appear at different times or on multiple frequencies. Late one Wednesday, he caught a stronger signal, this time featuring an advertisement urging listeners to support a local hardware store. The store's name was Palmer & Sons, located on Maple Street. The sponsor's message had a distinctly old-time ring, describing discount prices for paint and lumber. Then the voice vanished into the hush once more. Disturbed by how ephemeral these broadcasts were, Martin decided to undertake a more systematic investigation. He recorded short audio clips using his computer's sound card, capturing the music, announcements, and the garbled station ID. He hoped that by replaying them, he could decipher more details. After repeated listening, it became apparent that the station referred to itself as WNRV. Searching radio archives, he found references to a defunct station known as WNRV that had operated decades ago in a small area on the outskirts of a region once known by the name Redvale. That area apparently had been renamed or consolidated with other municipalities long ago. According to an old reference, WNRV had ended transmissions in the late 1950s. The cause for its closure was never spelled out in the short historical note Martin discovered. This set of facts stirred Martin's imagination. He pictured a station that had gone off air half a century earlier, only to reappear sporadically in the present day. Could it be that someone resurrected old recordings and broadcast them as a tribute? He considered the possibility that an eccentric radio hobbyist had set up a covert transmitter, playing vintage tapes from WNRV. The phenomenon might be no more than a strange but explainable homage. Nevertheless, the question of who was behind it and why remained unanswered. Martin also felt unsettled by the sense that the transmissions popped up without warning, as though triggered by a schedule outside normal explanation. Martin posted a short note on an online amateur radio forum describing his findings. He mentioned the call sign WNRV and the approximate times and frequencies at which he had heard the broadcast. He hoped others might have encountered it as well. The response was muted. A few members expressed interest. Some recalled hearing about a station from way back when, but nobody confirmed receiving the same transmissions. Martin's local colleagues found the story intriguing, but suspected it was simply a pirate or a remote rebroadcast from an archive. Still, Martin felt compelled to keep digging. He discovered a regional newspaper archive that included microfilmed articles from the 1950s. It took several days of searching before he located an article about WNRV's final broadcast. The piece mentioned that the station had closed abruptly following a series of financial troubles and the unexpected death of its lead announcer, a man named Arthur Bradley, who was well regarded in the community. Another story from around the same period referenced a local tragedy, a catastrophic fire that razed the station's building shortly after it went silent. The result was that WNRV never returned to the airwaves. Martin reread these bits of history multiple times, trying to see if any mention of Redvale or Redvale appeared. He found fleeting references that the region's name changed in the 1960s for economic development reasons, merging with a nearby larger town. Over time, both the name Redvale and the memory of WNRV faded from official records. Yet, the station that Martin heard continued to defy closure. Every few nights, around midnight, the old shortwave receiver burst into crackly life. The transmissions did not appear on a rigid schedule. Sometimes they repeated the same weather forecast or community bulletin, while at other times they played new segments. Once, Martin detected a partial reading of local obituaries, featuring names he had never heard. Another night, the station aired what sounded like a live coverage of a sporting event, presumably a small-town baseball game, with references to real players. The play-by-play was accompanied by distant crowd noise, as though truly broadcast from a long-lost decade. Martin's confusion and curiosity turned to unease when he noticed references to events that had not yet happened. At first, he dismissed the notion as a misunderstanding, but on one broadcast, the announcer mentioned the date as the 14th of November 1958, then immediately referred to a local bus accident said to have occurred today. Intrigued, Martin tried to verify the existence of such an event. A deeper newspaper search revealed that on November 14, 1958, indeed, there had been a bus crash near the old Redvale region, resulting in multiple injuries. The historical record matched the broadcast's content. This could have been explained if the station was simply replaying old tapes from that date. Yet, there were other references to current or future happenings that made no sense in a purely historical context. One evening, Martin was shocked to hear a bulletin that gave a date from the near future, something describing the date as a year beyond the present. The station's host calmly announced that local residents should brace for a severe storm expected on that date, advising them to stay indoors. The entire forecast sounded routine, except for the mismatch in time. At first, Martin assumed he had misheard, but re-listening to the recording, he confirmed that the broadcast indeed referred to a date not yet arrived. This collision of past and future, broadcast from a frequency no official record acknowledged, unnerved him. He began to suspect that the station existed in some sort of temporal limbo, merging historical reality with events not yet realized. The rational part of his mind resisted such a notion. He considered the possibility that a hoaxer was combining old recordings and newly scripted, futuristic news to spook gullible listeners. Yet the execution was so subtle, the references so obscure, that it exceeded typical pranks or pirate radio stunts. Martin decided to track down the site of the original WNRV station. Through property records, he found a location in a rural zone about 2 hours' drive from his city, near the hills that once formed part of the Redvale district. One Saturday, armed with a camera and a sense of rising excitement, he made the trip. The route took him through farmland and small, aging villages. Eventually, he arrived at a dead-end road lined with brush, with no obvious structures in sight. Consulting old maps and the approximate coordinates gleaned from property archives, he discovered a clearing overshadowed by tall grass and a few blackened stumps of wood. The place bore little evidence that a functional building had once stood there. Wandering through the clearing, Martin noticed the scattered remains of a foundation, crumbled concrete, rusted beams, and shards of glass. It was reminiscent of a site that had burned decades ago. An uneasy hush hung over the place. He felt a strange atmosphere, as though the land retained an imprint of the events that ended the station's operations. He took photographs, searching for any sign that might link the site to WNRV. Among the debris, he located a metal fragment, possibly once part of a transmitter or tower structure. It was impossible to know. He scanned the area with a handheld wideband receiver, but the band was silent. No trace of a broadcast emerged on the frequencies he had grown accustomed to hearing at home. Before leaving, he discovered a path leading into an overgrown wood. Near it lay a small, rusty signpost, the paint almost entirely flaked off. Straining to make out the faint letters, he could read Station RD, or something close to that. The sign's presence indicated that once there had indeed been a road recognized by local authorities, but now it was swallowed by vegetation. In that moment, Martin felt sure that the spot he was standing on was the final resting place of the original WNRV facility. Returning to his apartment at dusk, Martin found himself both intellectually stimulated and deeply disturbed. The physical evidence confirmed that the station had been destroyed long ago. Yet, night after night, its signals still flickered to life on his shortwave receiver. He spent hours confiding his thoughts in a private online journal, uncertain how to reconcile the contradictory facts. He considered whether local topography might be reflecting or refracting signals from a distant source. Another possibility was that someone had set up a clandestine transmitter precisely at or near the old site. But from what he witnessed, there was nothing left there to suggest that sort of modern setup. In the weeks that followed, the broadcasts took on an even more disconcerting tone. Martin began picking up bulletins about bizarre or catastrophic events that seemed well beyond ordinary small-town news. One segment spoke of an unexplainable phenomenon that caused entire flocks of birds to vanish from the skies. Another reported sightings of ghostly apparitions at an abandoned orchard. The language used was old-fashioned, as if read from a script in the 1950s. Yet the subject matter sounded strangely contemporary. The station's announcer, always the same calm male voice, mentioned the date as if it were in the late 1950s, then pivoted to talk about events that sounded ominous, sometimes referencing the year ahead in a way that did not align with any normal timeline. Martin's nights became restless. He dreaded and eagerly anticipated the midnight hour, uncertain what new mysteries or unnerving details he might uncover. The transmissions were sporadic. Some nights brought nothing but static, leaving him anxiously rechecking his wires and settings. Other nights, the station boomed through more clearly. On one of those stronger broadcasts, Martin distinctly heard mention of Arthur Bradley, the same lead announcer who had died decades before. The broadcast referred to him as though he were alive and well, cautioning that Mr. Bradley would soon deliver an urgent community message. Moments later, the music resumed, but no urgent statement followed. The station abruptly cut off, leaving Martin with only the hiss of empty air. Unable to rest, he revisited local archives, searching for more details about Arthur Bradley's life and the station's final days. He found an obituary dated December 1958, describing Bradley's passing as sudden and unexpected, apparently from a heart ailment, though rumors at the time mentioned possible foul play. Another piece reported that the station had tried to continue after Bradley's death, but soon faced financial ruin and technical failures. The catastrophic fire put an end to everything. Martin started to wonder if some piece of technology had survived the blaze. Perhaps the station's spirit or the ghost of a signal lingered in some dimension. The rational part of him scoffed at such an idea, but each broadcast felt more uncanny. He compiled recordings, creating a digital archive on his computer. By analyzing timestamps, he noted that the mysterious station often broadcast in short bursts, rarely lasting more than half an hour. The transmissions were always introduced by a distinctive piano melody, probably the station's old signature. Then news bulletins or announcements followed, interspersed with scratchy music from that era. Occasionally, the voice gave a date from the 1950s. At other times, it recited partial dates that seemed to reference the present or near future. Martin found a few mentions that correlated with events in his own day. For example, an announcement once spoke vaguely of a technology company near a city center halting operations after a data breach. A week later, Martin saw a headline about a major data breach at a local software firm. Although details did not match perfectly, the general correlation was unsettling. From these developments, Martin formed a startling hypothesis. The station's transmissions were not simply old recordings or an elaborate hoax. They might be some kind of fracture in time, a broadcast bridging eras, partly anchored in the past, partly foretelling a future shaped by obscure forces. This concept verged on the supernatural or science fiction territory, but he could not ignore the mounting anomalies. As December advanced, the station's tone grew ominous. One evening, the radio carried a bulletin about an upcoming disaster in Redvale, urging residents to take shelter and brace for violent storms. The date mentioned was December 20th, 1958, a day that historically corresponded with no recorded disaster. Yet the broadcast repeated the warning numerous times, describing black skies and raging winds that threatened to topple entire neighborhoods. Martin cross-referenced local weather archives from 1958, discovering no mention of a cataclysmic event. However, the broadcast's sense of alarm left him uneasy. He scribbled a note to himself, wondering if something in the present might align with that date. He hovered in tension as the 20th approached, fully expecting something dramatic to occur, though no major weather event took place in his actual timeline. As he mulled over the discrepancy, he recognized a chilling possibility. Perhaps the station was describing a timeline that never came to pass. Could it be that what he heard was a broadcast from a branching version of history, or that the station had tried in vain to warn its listeners of an impending tragedy that was somehow averted or hidden from official records? The idea of multiple timelines or suppressed events sounded absurd, but the entire phenomenon defied normal explanation anyway. When Christmas week arrived, Martin received an unexpected package by mail with no return address. Inside lay a single reel of audio tape labeled WNRV, Final Log. He owned no reel-to-reel player, so he scrambled to borrow one from an acquaintance who collected vintage electronics. Late one night, he threaded the tape, half expecting a hoax. The reel played a haunting mixture of static and muffled voices. After some minutes of scratchy noise, a man's voice, strong and grave, spoke the call letters WNRV. Then there followed a series of frantic remarks, references to fires raging across farmland, transmissions losing power, and a strange mention of the station's tower radiating signals that would not die. The voice concluded with a near whisper, sounding as though the speaker was running out of breath. Martin recognized the timbre. It matched the voice he had heard in his nightly broadcasts. It had to be Arthur Bradley. The reel ended abruptly. Martin remained transfixed by the final words, which implied that the station's signals had attained some unnatural persistence, as if haunted by the events that ended its existence. The question persisted: who sent him the reel, and how had it remained undiscovered for decades? He returned to the clearing in Redvale, now dusted with winter snow, to see if he could find any further clues. The building's ruins looked the same, lifeless. He discovered no footprints or other signs of recent activity. Yet for a moment, standing among the frosted grass, he felt a faint vibration or hum in the air, as though electricity crackled at the edge of hearing. He looked around, seeing no source. The hush of the countryside pressed in, and he left feeling no more certain than before. Back at his apartment, the next few weeks brought an escalation in the station's broadcasts. Some nights, the signal carried pleas for calm, describing a crisis that seemed to escalate from one show to the next. The announcer repeated warnings about unstoppable fires, referencing nighttime skies lit by flames. This talk corresponded with local rumors Martin unearthed in old newspaper letters to the editor, referencing a great blaze that might have been rumored but never documented. He started to suspect that WNRV had found itself in the grip of a cataclysmic event in an alternate historical thread, one never officially recognized in the real timeline. The station had apparently tried to hold on, broadcasting urgent messages to an audience perhaps already consumed by chaos. In January, Martin's resolve to solve the enigma intensified. The obsession grew so strong that friends noticed his distracted demeanor. He seldom socialized, preferring hours spent in front of his radio or rummaging through archives. While rummaging in an antique store, he stumbled upon a small WNRV memorabilia, pins, postcards, and a water-damaged schedule listing programming for 1958. This leftover ephemera confirmed that the station had been quite active, hosting variety shows, local talk segments, and nightly newscasts. The store owner had no recollection of how the items arrived in her shop, pointing only to a dusty corner of the store where estate sale artifacts were piled. Martin's nights were now overshadowed by bizarre nightmares in which he saw ghostly radio towers flickering in lightning-streaked skies or deserted studios echoing with phantom announcements. His living space itself felt saturated with a strange energy. He found himself checking the shortwave receiver at random times of day, as though expecting the station to break its usual midnight pattern. Sometimes, while scanning through the static, he believed he heard faint voices at frequencies far off from the official broadcast. His sense of reality began to blur, replaced by a half-certain dread that the station was creeping into every aspect of his existence. Then, at the end of January, something unprecedented happened. The broadcast flared to life in the early evening, about 7 p.m., with near-perfect clarity. Martin almost dropped the coffee mug he was holding. The music came through with minimal interference, a haunting big band tune from the era. The announcer's voice had urgency, addressing residents of Redvale, urging them to find safety. The background contained a crackling roar, as though flames ate at the station's surroundings. The announcer repeated that the date was January 31st, 1959, describing unstoppable wildfires, high winds, and an imminent threat to the entire region. He spoke of mass evacuations that were not happening quickly enough. Martin listened, paralyzed, as the broadcast ended in what sounded like a final outcry for help. Then the frequency fell silent. Shaken, Martin quickly researched local records. No mention of a catastrophic fire on January 31st, 1959 existed. The real Redvale area was never recorded as destroyed. Yet he possessed the real tape, the repeated references in news archives to a station closure, the burnt ruins of the property, And now this final broadcast describing a cataclysm that official history ignored. Martin spent the night in deep turmoil, wrestling with the possibility that WNRV was broadcasting from a timeline where the region was indeed consumed by a massive fire, overshadowing all else. Meanwhile, in his timeline, events had diverged, leaving behind only rumors and the station's abrupt closure. He tried to contact the handful of online acquaintances who had expressed mild interest before. Most found the story extraordinary but had no direct evidence themselves. A few speculated about metaphysical or paranormal explanations. Others recommended that Martin see a therapist, suspecting that stress or grief was fueling illusions. Martin recognized that none of them had personally heard the station, and he had grown so consumed by the phenomenon that it was easy to see why they doubted him. As time wore on, the station's broadcasts diminished in frequency. Martin caught fleeting bursts of static and faint music, but rarely the strong signals of the previous weeks. It was as though the station's final energies were ebbing. The last full broadcast he managed to record aired in mid-February, with the announcer's voice sounding weak, referencing the last stand of WNRV. It was an agonized soliloquy, describing a studio engulfed in swirling ash, staff members fleeing, and Arthur Bradley's attempt to keep the broadcast going as a beacon of hope. Then came a mention that something beyond the horizon was devouring the entire region. The speaker insisted that the signal had to carry on to reach anyone who might be listening, offering a final message: even if no one else remains, let WNRV's voice endure. Following that night, the station never returned. Martin continued to check meticulously. Day after day, midnight after midnight, he heard nothing more on those frequencies. He tested various antennas, suspecting a shift. He explored neighboring bands, scanning for a stray fragment. The airwaves were silent. It was as though WNRV had finally exhausted its spectral broadcast, leaving Martin alone with his recordings, diaries, and the chilling story of a station that had perished in flames in some alternate or hidden thread of time. In the aftermath, Martin compiled everything into an extensive digital journal. He stored the audio clips, typed transcripts, old news articles, and photos of the station's ruins. On reflection, he discerned a narrative in WNRV's transmissions, from routine local bulletins to ominous warnings about unstoppable fires, culminating in the meltdown of the station's final broadcast. Whether it had truly been an echo from an alternate dimension, or some supernatural playback of doomed past events, Martin never managed to prove. In the spring, he made one final journey to the clearing. This time, the grass was lush, the wildflowers blooming. The remains of the foundation looked even more inconspicuous, half buried by new growth. The hush of the place seemed peaceful, erasing the terror once described in the station's bulletins. Martin lingered, imagining how the building must have stood, staff inside cheerfully broadcasting music for a small audience. He found it impossible to believe that entire story might have ended in a blaze. Yet a sense of intangible heaviness clung to the air, as if the boundary between that lost broadcast and the living world remained tenuously present. He paid silent respects to the men and women whose voices had traversed time, real or otherwise, and then turned away. Back home, life gradually returned to normal. Martin resumed focusing on his day job, spending less time scanning frequencies. Yet the recordings of WNRV remained a quiet testament to the impossible. Occasionally, he revisited them, especially on nights of insomnia. The vintage piano melody and the archaic newscaster's tone still evoked a shiver. Part of him felt he had witnessed a phenomenon that defied logic, perhaps a tear in the veil of time or a final cry from an unreconciled tragedy. Another part still wondered if a cunning hoaxer had orchestrated the entire spectacle. But who would go to such lengths, with no apparent motive? No definitive answer surfaced. The only certainty was that the ghostly station had, for a few short weeks, beamed its strange transmissions into Martin's humble receiver, weaving its tale of everyday life overshadowed by disaster. When it vanished, it left behind more questions than answers. Over the months and years that followed, Martin occasionally posted fragments of his story on specialized forums. Reactions ran the gamut from awe to derision. A few individuals insisted they had heard something similar decades ago, referencing an unmarked shortwave station that played big band music and recited outdated announcements. Their recollections were hazy, and no one possessed the breadth of evidence Martin had gathered. Most readers either suggested a rational explanation or dismissed it outright, yet Martin stood firm in his knowledge of what he had heard. On rare nights, if the sky was particularly clear and the city noise lessened, Martin took out the old shortwave receiver, letting its tubes glow in the dimly lit corner of his apartment. He methodically spun the dial through the hiss, hoping for a sliver of that impossible broadcast. Though the station never returned, he believed that somewhere in the tapestry of existence, WNRV might still endure, forever locked in an eternal loop, replaying the final days of Redvale. If fate or cosmic chance allowed it, perhaps the station's voice would find another stray receiver in another time, passing along its half-century-old bulletins as a whisper from an unfathomable reality. In his private reflections, Martin came to view the entire experience as a strange gift. It reminded him that the world, for all its technological advances and carefully filed records, still held hidden corners that defied neat explanation. He thought of the men and women who had once relied on local radio for news and entertainment, never dreaming that their station's final transmissions might echo forward into unknown eras, carrying warnings or laments about a future that never was, or a future that might yet be. That sense of the extraordinary, mingled with sorrow, guided Martin toward a deeper appreciation of everyday life. Whenever he felt the tug of the ordinary, he recalled the Phantom Station's sign-off, resonating with a lonely sincerity that transcended any single timeline. Even if no one else remains, let WNRV's voice endure.